We're going to turn to the next item of business, which is a statement by the Cabinet Secretary, John Swinney, on education recovery. I would invite all members who wish to ask a question following Mr Swinney's statement to press their request to speak buttons, and I call on the Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, when I addressed Parliament on the 19th of March, I said that the decision to close schools was one of the very toughest we had needed to take during this crisis. My engagement with teachers, children and parents since has only served to reinforce that view. For that reason, while it has been critical to suppress the virus, we have been clear that these closures cannot go on for a minute longer than necessary. We want Scotland's children back in school full-time as soon as possible and as soon as it is safe to do so. That ambition is shared within the Education Recovery Group, our partnership with local government, unions representing teachers and other school staff, and parent representatives. Presiding Officer, today I want to set out the Government's ambitions for when that full-time return to school might be. When I published the strategic framework from the Education Recovery Group report on the 21st of May, we had a clear expectation that the outlook on coronavirus was bleak. At that point, there were around 20,000 people in Scotland who could transmit the infection. On the 21st of May, 1,318 people were in hospital with confirmed or suspected COVID-19, including 51 in intensive care. Tragically, over the course of that week, 230 people passed away from the virus. And not only was that position bleak, but at that time the majority view of our scientific advisers was that physical distancing would be necessary if schools were to reopen. Blended learning was developed, therefore, to restore some form of face-to-face education against that outlook. Working through the Education Recovery Group, we built a plan based on making the very best of the very difficult circumstances that we expected to face. It was a contingency plan that was and is necessary. And for the last month, councils and teachers have been working hard to enact that contingency. Presiding Officer, even while we took this work forward, we continued to make the point that we did not want to see blended learning implemented for a moment longer than necessary. Now, thankfully, the picture looks more positive. Since May, because of the efforts of our fellow citizens to stay at home, we have seen Scotland make significant progress. There are now only 2,000 infectious people in Scotland, a reduction of around 90% since May. There has been a sustained downward trend in COVID-19 deaths. Intensive care cases now stand at a fraction of what they were. If we stay on this trajectory, which cannot be taken for granted, by August, the position will be even better. That is good news. That means we are now able to update our planning assumptions. If we stay on track, if we all continue to do what is right, and if we can further suppress this terrible virus, the Government believes that we should prepare for children to be able to return to school full-time in August. I must stress, this is the aim that the Government is now working towards. However, because it has to be achieved safely, it inevitably remains conditional and dependent upon ongoing scientific and health advice. Presiding Officer, this will be part of a wider approach. If we continue to make progress at the rate we envisage, by August it is possible, though of course by no means certain, that we may have successfully achieved or be well on the way to Phase 4 of the Scottish Government route map. I have to be honest with Parliament and admit that when we prepared our plans back in May, I frankly could not have imagined that we would have made as much progress in virus suppression as we have. Presiding Officer, it is this more positive outlook that allows the Scottish Government to make this change of planning assumption for schools. But it is a change born out of the hard work and sacrifice of people in every part of the country, sticking to the guidance, staying at home and suppressing this virus. In particular, we should highlight the many people who, as parents, have supported their children while continuing to hold down jobs and caring commitments. It is a change born of the actions of our citizens. They delivered it. Now it falls to the Scottish Government, our local government colleagues, teachers and school staff to build on it. I want to commend the work of local authorities and school and early learning and childcare staff, and particularly head teachers across Scotland, for the way in which they have responded to this emergency. They have worked tirelessly to protect the interests of our children and young people through our childcare hubs, ensuring ongoing provision of free school meals, delivering remote learning and planning for the next term. I know they will continue to rise to the challenge as we get ready for the next school year. Presiding Officer, that is the good news. But I must emphasise the importance of Scotland staying on track if we are to make it a reality. And we must be clear that blended learning is a contingency that we may still need to enact. While the outlook is more positive now, there are no certainties with this virus. If there is an increase in infection rates, if there are outbreaks that require action to control, then this contingency plan could still be required. Equally, we still need to protect those in our society who may not be able to attend school for health reasons. All the work that has gone into preparing blended learning models for every locality across the country has been essential preparation. It is vital that we have these models ready if we need them, because we may need to turn to them. We must continue to ensure the safety of pupils, teachers and staff by engaging in such contingency planning, and that is why Her Majesty's Inspectors of Education will continue with their scrutiny of the plans when the latest versions are submitted by local authorities on Wednesday. Similarly, we can only move away from blended learning if we stay on track and command the confidence of parents, teachers and children on safety. But there are important benefits of doing so. A return to full-time schooling would enhance the life chances of our children and young people and start to reverse any damaging impacts of recent months. We know from lockdown lowdown, for example, that young people are concerned about school closures and about their mental well-being. If we are in a position to ease public health measures in early learning and childcare, particularly small group working, more children and families will be able to benefit from an expanded offer in the year ahead. In parallel, we continue to work in partnership with local authorities to agree a new timetable for the delivery of the 1,140 hours entitlement to all eligible children. We are already seeing other countries begin to relax their physical distancing restrictions in schools, for younger children in particular, and others are starting to plan for a more normal return after the summer break. The First Minister confirmed on the 15th of June that we will now review the scientific assumptions underpinning education recovery as part of our statutory 3-weekly review process. This will include, for example, reviewing our approach to physical distancing in schools and equivalent measures in early learning and childcare. As part of that review process, I have established a new subgroup of the COVID-19 Advisory Group to specialise on education and children's issues. We will get the first review of that material later this week. I would not want to preempt such advice, but in order for us to realise our ambition to resume full-time schooling, I would expect that various conditions would need to be in place. First, infection rates must be at a level that is sufficiently low to provide assurance that we can continue to control the virus. Second, we must ensure that we make use of our full public health infrastructure, locally and nationally, to get early warning of issues and rapid local action, including test and protect. Third, there must be the right protective measures and risk assessments in place in schools to keep everyone with higher risk factors, including teachers and staff, safe at all times. In addition to these, the COVID-19 Advisory Group and the new subgroup have been asked for further advice on any tests or indicators which would show we are on track. In all of this, I will work closely with the Education Recovery Group. Given the change in our central planning assumption to work towards full-time return to schools in August, we will continue to work together over the summer. Local authorities will then communicate arrangements for the return to school with families in due course. Presiding Officer, we will need all possible education resources at our disposal over the next year to compensate for the loss of learning pupils have faced, as well as to help us should we need to switch to a blended model at any stage. Even with a return to full-time education, it is imperative that we increase levels of digital inclusion, which is why we have already committed to a huge digital boost through the investment of £30 million to provide laptops for disadvantaged children and young people. This will include £25 million of funding to enable a rollout of digital devices to school pupils to enable them to study online. Initial estimates from local authorities are that this funding will be required to provide digital devices to around 70,000 pupils, with up to 40,000 connectivity solutions also needed, although these figures are the subject of ongoing work. I can also announce today that we will be providing a further £100 million over the next 2 years to help support the return to school and help children recover any lost ground. This new funding will see us invest to tackle the impact of coronavirus in our schools and ensure that children get the support that they need. We will start with teacher recruitment. Many of this year's probationer teachers have already secured teaching posts with local authorities. We will now work with local authorities with the objective of ensuring that every probationer teacher who has reached the standard for full registration is able to secure a teaching post for the next school year. And of course, we will still look to encourage retired teachers and those who are not currently teaching back into the profession wherever this proves necessary. I have asked Education Scotland to expand their partnership offer with the eSchool digital learning platform to develop a strong national e-learning provision. This represents an opportunity to enable all pupils to access high-quality lessons by qualified teachers trained in offering high-quality online learning across as broad a range of subjects and qualification levels as possible. And finally, while we want to support the well-being of all of our children and young people, we know lockdown has been particularly difficult for pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds. Reducing the poverty-related attainment gap is a defining mission of this government. We will therefore be working alongside partners to increase support to those families and communities who need it most. We will also seek the involvement of the youth work sector in assisting us in this challenge. Presiding Officer, coronavirus has had a massive impact on our education system. It will take a collective endeavour to overcome that, but we have a duty to our children and young people to come together to do just that. They have played their part in protecting this country from the worst of the pandemic, and now we must repay them that faith by serving their needs at this critical time.
Thank you very much. The Cabinet Secretary will now take questions. Jamie Green to be followed by Ian Gray.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for advance sight of his comments? And firstly, let me agree with them that I recognise that none of this has been easy. I recognise that parents and teachers have been trying their very best to deliver education throughout some very difficult few months. We thank them and we thank young people too. But the Cabinet Secretary has finally heard those voices, many thousands of them, even those from his backbenches. Parents have been scunnered by all of this. Why, up until today, were councils still working on plans to deliver just 1 or 2 days of schooling a week? Why did it take such an outburst of anger from parents and demands for statements from these benches and others to get clarity from this government? The sad truth, Presiding Officer, is that until now, recent events have exposed nothing but a complete vacuum of leadership in the handling of this issue. The reality is that today's U-turn, and it is that, has been forced upon the government after relentless campaigning from all quarters, political, academic, charitable, and most importantly by parents themselves, to whom we owe the most credit in all of this. Let us be clear, though. This is our chance to be clear to parents watching this about what we are saying to them and about what we are saying to councils who will have to deliver this. So let me ask Cabinet Secretary a number of things. Are you confirming now that all pupils will now return to school full-time on August the 11th, in all classrooms, in all schools? What are the specific health and scientific triggers which will enable you to give the green light for that to happen? Can you confirm that to achieve 100% capacity, when you've stopped heckling me, maybe I can ask the Cabinet Secretary some questions that parents want to know the answers to. Can you confirm, Cabinet Secretary, that to achieve 100% capacity in schools, There will be no physical social distancing to achieve that. Presiding officer, how can I ask questions when the SNP benches are shouting at me? When parents out there are listening and they need clarity.
Let's have
exactly
some order in the
what we're
chamber.
trying to achieve in this statement.
We heard Mr Swinney deliver a statement. Let's hear Mr Green deliver his questions, please. Mr Green.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can the Cabinet Secretary confirm that to achieve the 100% capacity that he wants, there therefore will be no physical social distancing in schools to make that possible? Under what circumstances will we revert to the blended model as the Plan A, not the contingency plan? But most importantly, Presiding Officer, words are one thing, actions will be another. Will you ensure that councils right across Scotland will now be given everything and whatever they need, whatever it takes, to get all our children back into school full-time? No ifs, no buts.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I frequently appear in front of Parliament, either personally or remotely, for the domestic circumstances that I have, to answer the questions of members. So the idea that this is somehow a surprise appearance by me in Parliament is a fallacy. Because I was here in person on the 18th of June to answer portfolio questions. I answered topical questions from my son's bedroom on the 16th of June. I appeared in front of committee again from my son's bedroom on the 12th of June. I answered portfolio questions on the 28th of May. And I made a statement to Parliament on the 26th of May, I think again from my son's bedroom. All these occasions since the publication of the Education Recovery Group report. So the Conservatives don't dare suggest that I do not appear in front of this Parliament to fulfil my duties. It is a disgraceful slur by the Conservatives to suggest that. Now, there were a number of questions in Mr Green's points, which of course were dealt with by the statement that I made. I said that our planning assumption is to get all pupils back to school in August. I said that there will have to be scientific advice taken to enable that to be the case. I said that we will revert to blended learning should the circumstances of a proliferation of the virus require us to do so, because not to do so would endanger the health and well-being of children and staff, and I will not do it under any circumstances whatsoever. And I announced in my statement that the government is going to make available £100 million of new money which will support the delivery of our ambitions on education, to support children and young people, because they have supported us. That is what this government does, and the Conservatives can complain all they want from the sidelines in this process.
Ian Gray to be followed by Ross Greer. Ian Gray.
Thank you very much, and thank you also to Mr Swinney for early sight of his statement. I once accused the Education Secretary of the mother of ministerial climb downs. Well, he's outdone himself today. This must be the mother and father of ministerial climb downs. All of those occasions he just described, when he has spoken to Parliament about this plan, it has been clear that blended learning was the only possibility for August. 10 days ago, Mr Swinney thought it might last a year. On Friday, his co-chair of the Education Recovery Group confirmed blended learning was the only plan. And now, at the last possible moment, we have a completely new plan. Well, we asked for a route map back to schools. It turns out we've been on a mystery tour. Presiding Officer, if we can deliver this safely, it is very welcome news. But what a fine mess this is. There are still more questions than answers. What, if any, social distancing will be required in the classroom? That question wasn't answered, and indeed on school transport too. What protective measures, PPE, deep cleaning and testing will be required to keep teachers and staff safe? And finally, will the Education Secretary publish today the new evidence on which he bases this new plan?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, let me address the points that Ian Gray has made. In relation to the question on physical distancing, a resumption of full-time education for young people assumes there is no physical distancing amongst young people. Now, we believe that is possible when we look at the models being delivered in other countries that have successfully restored education, particularly the Netherlands is an example of exactly that. There will be required to be stringent measures taken to ensure that we have in place the appropriate arrangements for safety, for protection, for testing, all of which I covered in my statement today, because these are absolutely fundamental issues that have to be put in place. And the reason why we are able to come to the decisions that we have come to today and to commence the work that we are taking forward to assume full-time learning in August is because of the significant change in progress that has been made. And I covered that in my statement, where we did not believe it would be possible to get the levels of coronavirus infection in our society as low as they are today. And that is because the public have done their bit, more than done their bit, to comply with these approaches. So we now have an opportunity, if we sustain that commitment, because it's not all over yet, we've got to sustain that commitment. And if the public sustain that commitment and compliance, we can be in a position. So it is conditional, but it's conditional on us having the correct regime in place and the compliance measures being followed by members of the public. And given past performance, I'm confident members of the public will support us in this endeavour and will work collaboratively and collectively to enable us to return schools full-time in August.
Thank you. Ross Greer, to be followed by Willie Rennie. Ross Greer.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and like colleagues, I thank the Cabinet Secretary for advance sight of his statement. A great number of people will be breathing a sigh of relief today, but for others, their anxiety has now increased significantly for school staff and their families. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary if the Scottish Government will immediately publish the evidence and the expert advice it has received, which has led them to the conclusion that this is a safe option to pursue? And can I ask if school staff will be offered regular testing, as Professor Devi Schrader has advised would be necessary to achieve this level of safe full-time return?
Cabinet Secretary.
As Mr Greer will know, we have published the scientific advice upon which our plans have been based, and I give him the commitment that we will continue to do so. The conclusions the Government has arrived at here, and I've covered this in my answer to Mr Gray a moment ago, is because of the significant reduction in the prevalence of coronavirus and the level of infectiousness within our society. But I have to be explicit with Parliament, this is a conditional commitment. It is conditional on us being able to sustain that position. It is conditional on the further scientific assessments, tests and challenges that are put in front of us by the advisory group. And all of that information will continue to be published. So Mr Greer has my commitment that we will remain open in that respect. Now, Mr Greer asked me about regular testing of teachers. I'm very supportive of that because I recognise the importance of building confidence in the teaching profession about their own safety, their own circumstances, because I do accept they are in a different position with a different degree of exposure than most young people in a school setting. So it is important that the issue that Mr Greer raises is addressed, and that will of course be part of the detailed work that we undertake within the Education Recovery Group.
Willie Rennie, to be followed by Claire Adamson.
I welcome this decision, and I think so will thousands of concerned parents across the country. But the Deputy First Minister cannot seriously claim that this was a sudden change in the control of the virus. The trend has been clear for some time, and he should just admit that. But I want the Minister to address another problem, an issue that I have raised repeatedly and has still not been addressed adequately. That is the issue of childcare right now over the summer. Normal childcare arrangements for parents have disappeared. We don't have the childcare arrangements available for childminders or the normal family arrangements, but they're expected to go back to work. So what is the Deputy First Minister going to do for them today?
Cabinet Secretary.
On Mr Rennie's first point, he is correct that there has been a declining trend, but I would encourage him to look at the sharpness of the decline that has taken place, which has, frankly, and I admitted this in my statement, has surprised us that it has moved at the pace that it has moved. That is a product of the compliance and the cooperation of members of the public, and I am all ministers are profoundly grateful to them for what they have contributed. And that has enabled us to, and this relates to the comments the First Minister will make tomorrow when she appears in Parliament as well, where she will give some further information on the implementation of the route map, which of itself and the pace at which we can be confident about the steps that we're taking through that will reflect exactly the same point that I'm making to Mr Rennie in my answer. Now, his questions on childcare. There is, of course, childcare provision available over the summer. The hubs will be maintained. Childminders are able to be in operation. What's important is that we also look at what will be the possibilities opened up by the statement that the First Minister makes us tomorrow. And Mr Rennie will understand that I'm not in a position to discuss those details today, but he will have his opportunity tomorrow to question the First Minister on those issues.
Thank you. Claire Adamson to be followed by Jamie Halker-Johnson.
Presiding Officer, the safety and well-being of our staff, our pupils and the wider community remains the absolute priority. And I would like to thank the councils, the parent groups, the professional associations, the trade unions, who all worked with the government in the Education Recovery Group. Can the Cabinet Secretary tell us what access the Recovery Group will have to scientific advisers to ensure that their deliberations over the summer are informed by timely evidence, the best available?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, the Education Recovery Group will have all the access it wishes to interact with the scientific advisers. The Recovery Group heard from Professor Andrew Morris and Professor Sheila Rowan, who are part of Professor Morris chairs the advisory group and Professor Rowan is the Government's Chief Scientific Advisor. The Education Recovery Group had access to both Professor Morris and Professor Rowan, and I will be very happy to facilitate access for the education recovery to any of the scientific experts who provide us with advice during the course of the summer, because it's absolutely vital that teachers, professional associations, their representatives and the representatives of school support staff, we have a representative from Unison on the Education Recovery Group, are confident in the arrangements that we put in place, because everybody's interests have got to be respected.
Thank you. Jamie Halker-Johnson to be followed by Daniel Johnson.
Thank you. Many parents are currently forced to juggle home working with supporting home learning, often while having to provide childcare for younger children. Many are exhausted, and for some it's causing real mental health issues. So does the Education Secretary recognise that parents need to know as soon as possible when nurseries will be fully able to reopen? And given that many are facing severe financial issues, some at real risk of having to close, does he recognise that many don't have time to wait for the Scottish Government and COSLA to agree a new timetable? So will he ensure councils recommit to delivering 1140 hours and that the funding is in place for them to do so?
Cabinet Secretary.
I acknowledge the significance of the issues that Mr Halker-Johnson raises about the burden that parents are carrying. I entirely accept that. This has been a tough time all round, and particularly for parents who have been juggling work with childcare and supporting learning, and I pay tribute to them. And then many people will also have financial worries added on to all of this as well, not to mention their own circumstances in their own family life. So I totally accept that, and it has been a tough time. We want to move to the opening up of all of these services as early as we possibly can do. But we have to we have to work our way through this. The First Minister will say more about this in the course of her comments tomorrow to Parliament. What the Minister for Children and Young People and I have tried to do in working with COSLA is to provide as much financial stability as we can to private providers in the early learning and childcare sector, because we will need them. We will need them to contribute towards the wider efforts that we are taking forward. So we will pursue these issues with all urgency, because it is an essential part of the infrastructure of our society to have early learning childcare providers able to function in a fashion that would be acceptable to families around the country.
Daniel Johnson to be followed by Emma Harper.
Breakfast and after-school provision is vital for many working parents. The lack of consideration of these elements from the so-called blended learning contingency plan was forcing many parents to contemplate choosing between work and their children's education. Will before and after school provision form a key assumption for the return to 100% schooling, and what resource will be made available to ensure its return?
Cabinet Secretary.
I acknowledge the importance of these issues. We will certainly consider these points as we look to the resumption of full-time schooling. What I would say to Mr Johnson is that the blended learning model was designed to improve on the current situation that we have. It was to get some formal schooling available for children and young people. But at no stage would I say it was a panacea. It was there to, and remains there, because we may have to rely on this in due course to enable the resumption of formal schooling, and the issues that Mr Johnson raises about some of the critical support that enables families to operate effectively will be part of the planning that we'll look to about the resumption of full-time schooling.
Emma Harper to be followed by Richard Lyle.
I'd like to ask the Cabinet Secretary whether any local authorities, such as the Fleece and Galloway Council, held conversations with the Scottish Government regarding the process for utilising additional council or third sector buildings for educational purposes in order to allow for an increased number of young people to receive face-to-face learning where appropriate.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, the Education Recovery Group report included a requirement on local authorities to maximise the amount of face-to-face learning that was available for children and young people, and the local authorities were encouraged to be innovative and creative about the use of buildings either within their own estate that were not currently being used for educational purposes, or other buildings that might be available in the localities, town halls, village halls, other ancillary facilities. These will all be contained within the plans that are brought forward by individual local authorities. That is what I have asked Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Education to consider and to assess, to give me assurance that all possible options have been explored and examined to ensure that the educational opportunities for children and young people are maximised as a consequence of that work.
Richard Lyle to be followed by Liz Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Cabinet Secretary, at the start of this pandemic, every MSP received many emails imploring us to close schools. Yes, we are receiving the emails asking us to reopen schools fully. But as the grandfather of 4 with 2 young children at school, I want to ensure that they and others are safe. Cabinet Secretary, I'm happy with your proposals. There are 7 weeks to go before schools need to reopen. 7 weeks for us to review any proposals. Yes, you have had to plan. Will you constantly review the science to ensure that we fully reopen schools on the 11th of August and make sure that our kids and the staff are safe?
Cabinet Secretary.
Mr Lyle's point about the safety of children and staff is uppermost in my mind, and I hope I've demonstrated that to Parliament in the answers that I've given today, which is why the Government, and if the Government is criticised for anything, it is for erring on the side of caution in the protection of individuals' health. Now, Mr Lyle also makes an important point about the fact that the arrangements that we are talking about do not have to come into effect tomorrow. They have to come into effect in 7 weeks' time. So we have an opportunity as a country, and I make this appeal to the country because, and the country's done this before, to observe the guidance and the regulations and the rules that we've put in place, because if we do that, with 7 more weeks under our belt, we will make even more progress in that respect. So I encourage members of the public to do that, because if we do, we will be able to have a safe return to schooling in August.
Liz Smith to be followed by Annabel Ewing.
Thank you. Assuming that there is no outbreak of COVID-19 again and that schools do return full-time in August, as the Cabinet Secretary has announced, could I ask him to confirm whether it is his intention that the 2021 Diet of SQA exams will happen on schedule in April? And if he can't tell us that today, could he confirm as soon as possible to schools what the intention will be?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think what I can best say to Liz Smith today is that the planning intention is that the 2021 exam diet will take place, and the planning is being put in place for that. And my expectation is that it will take place. Liz Smith asked me if I could confirm it will take place in April. I'm not sure I can go quite that far, because there will be an argument for slightly delaying the exam diet to provide more learning and teaching opportunities for senior phase candidates, which would not prejudice the ability to declare the results in the August of 2021 to then enable access to higher and further education. So I'm talking about perhaps a delay of a matter of weeks, because the exam diet would be scheduled to start somewhere around the third week in April. So if there is an opportunity, because young people have lost a period of learning, they would normally have started classes at the latest probably in early June. Some would have started them in May for National 5 candidates. So there may be a slight delay to the timetable, but the planning assumption is the 2021 exam diet will go ahead.
Annabel Ewing to be followed by Sarah Boyack.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Deputy First Minister will be aware that children and young people with additional support needs will be facing particular challenges at this time. Can he therefore provide some reassurance that local authorities, including Fife Council, will be putting in place sufficient support to ensure that the transition back of these particular children and young people will be effected with minimal disruption to their learning?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think Annabel Ewing raises an important issue, and it's one that has to be handled in a sensitive and case-by-case basis, because the circumstances for young people with additional support needs must be assessed individually to determine what would be the most suitable transition mechanisms to enable their return to full-time learning. So for some, that might be a swift return. For others, it might be a slower return. But crucially, that assessment must be made on a child-by-child basis.
Sarah Boyack to be followed by Alec Neil.
What costings has the Scottish Government done on the additional investment he's announced today, given the additional protective measures the Deputy First Minister has said will be needed in terms of cleaning and capacity to ensure safe measures for teachers, for young people and for support staff? And will school buses have to meet social distancing requirements?
Cabinet Secretary.
On the first question, obviously we will have dialogue with our local authority partners about these questions, about the cost issues, and that's something to which we committed in the Education Recovery Group. On the issue about school transport, if Sarah Boyack will forgive me, I feel that's a question that would be best answered once we receive some more detail on the scientific requirements that we have. As I mentioned in my earlier answer, I think to Ian Gray, there is a number of approaches internationally where schools have resumed without physical distancing between individuals. That would obviously be relevant on whether it's in classrooms or in buses. We need to reflect on that advice and to determine whether it's appropriate. But what I give Sarah Boyack, the assurances I gave to Ross Greer earlier, is that all of that information will be shared openly to enable scrutiny by members of Parliament and members of the public.
Alec Neil to be followed by Brian Whittle.
Thank you very much indeed, Presiding Officer. Can I very much welcome the statement by the Cabinet Secretary and ask him if he will ensure that all newly qualified teachers are now offered timiously a contract of employment to ensure that no staff shortages will in any way hinder the plans to try to get back to full-time education by the 11th of August. And can I ask him if he will virtually, if necessary, update the Parliament of progress during the summer recess?
Cabinet Secretary.
I'll be very happy to update Parliament on all aspects of this at any occasion requested by Parliament, and I will come forward with updates in due course. Obviously, in relation to the scientific advice, there will be responses every 3 weeks from the First Minister, where we will be able to update in general on the phasing and look specifically at the scientific advice. In relation to newly qualified teachers, I had a very, very helpful conversation with a group of newly qualified teachers on Monday. They expressed to me and shared with me some of the challenges they are facing about securing employment. I hope what I've set out today gives confidence to local authorities about the support that is available to enhance the recruitment of newly qualified teachers, because we do have an opportunity to supplement the teaching workforce at a time when we really will benefit from it to support catch-up learning and other opportunities. And I look forward to the dialogue with local authorities to enable that to be the case.
Brian Whittle, to be followed by Sandra White.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Cabinet Secretary, following on from Alec Neil's question there, we've heard from newly qualified teachers that have not yet been contacted 14 weeks into this crisis. We've also been contacted by retired teachers willing to return to help who haven't had a response yet from the Scottish Government. There are also teachers in my area who have been asked to go back to work but have young children of their own who either have to go to school or to a nursery and have yet to find out how that will work. And of course there's those who have to continue to shield. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary, if the blended learning model is still required, can we guarantee parents that there are enough teachers to allow delivery of the education that their children are entitled to?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I obviously want to give that guarantee to parents. That's at the heart of everything I do as Education Secretary. I think in relation to the point on newly qualified teachers, local authorities are working through the recruitment of newly qualified teachers. I suspect it's slightly later in the year, which I suspect is for understandable reasons, that local authorities have got a lot on their plate just now with multiple issues. But if I take, for example, North Lanarkshire, on Thursday there was a lot of North Lanarkshire NQTs did not know what their future was, but on Friday they did, because North Lanarkshire Council confirmed they were retaining all 195 newly qualified teachers, which was very welcome. So we want to make sure that we have those commitments made by local authorities. What I'm putting on the table is additional resources to help to ensure that more newly qualified teachers can be recruited. As for the retired teachers' point, if Mr Whittle has any particular examples of people who have volunteered through the General Teaching Council, I would ask him to advise me of them, and I will make sure they are contacted, because I do think in the forthcoming year there will be a need to supplement the availability of teaching staff, because there will be some teachers who cannot come to work because of health issues related to COVID, and it will be important that we have the maximum teaching workforce in place to address that. So if Mr Whittle would furnish me with details, I'll happily pursue that.
Sandra White, to be followed by Claire Baker.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Cabinet Secretary, you made it absolutely clear, and thank you for your statement, that individual local authorities will be preparing their own models for reopening schools, depending on their local needs as we move towards the reopening in August. Can the Cabinet Secretary tell us if the Educational Recovery Group will be exploring best practice across all local authorities and councils and sharing that information to ensure a level of consistency and approach to educational delivery for everyone, children and young people?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, I'm very happy to give Sandra White that assurance. It's the Educational Recovery Group includes Education Scotland, and Education Scotland have been hosting discussions between local authorities to enable the sharing of practice, supporting, of course, the work that is underway through the Regional Improvement Collaboratives that I established. So the answer is yes, and it's important that good practice is shared across the education system.
And Claire Baker.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. There is evidence that there are significant differences in the level of engagement between young people and children with virtual learning. Will the Cabinet Secretary support an equality audit to be carried out when children return to school to ensure they are at the appropriate level in their learning?
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm very happy to commit to that.
Now, conscious that there are a large number of members, 10 members who wish still to ask questions, but I'm afraid there's too much business this afternoon to allow any extra time for this statement. There will be opportunities to ask questions tomorrow at First Minister's Questions. We're just going to pause shortly before we move on to the next item of business.